Want to stop a climate disaster? Well, in this video, I'm gonna summarize exactly what I learned from Bill Gates and his book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. Climate change is no small challenge. We need to innovate at unnatural speeds, not only in the realm of technology, but also public policy. And also, as a social species, bring together nations across the world on the same platform and all pool in our resources and time for that same mission. Bill Gates says that the climate is like a bathtub that's slowly filling up with water. Even if we slow the flow of water to a trickle, the tub will eventually fill up and water will come spilling out onto the floor. That's the disaster we have to prevent. Setting a goal to only reduce our emissions but not eliminate them simply won't do. And that's exactly why I decided to pick up this book. Bill Gates is an advocate for net zero, but also is an advocate for nuclear energy. He is an incredible innovator, he's a visionary leader, and also a thought leader. So a lot of his perspectives on technologies and also social movements really align with my interests. So when I saw this book come out, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, immediately picked it up. Excited to share the summary of this book with you. But before we start off, hey friends, my name is Osama Beg. I have a background in nuclear engineering, and on this channel, I help demystify nuclear technologies by simplifying them. I also like to summarize and review the books that I've read in the past. I think it's a great resource if you're ever interested and not really fully committed to reading the entire book. You just want a bit of a taste test. So let's deep dive into this video. The first thing I really enjoyed about this book is how it puts climate change into perspective, crafting that story and allowing us to understand climate change from an objective perspective. And Bill does a really good job at that. I also like how he starts off with the basics around climate change, such as what are the different types of greenhouse gases and also what are the underlying causes behind the greenhouse effect. So comparing methane to carbon to various other types of gases, going back to the basics is really refreshing. And I'm personally a big fan of always going back to scientific concepts that seem very, very simple in elementary. So things that you would learn in elementary school, but when you refer back to them and read about them, you have that newfound appreciation. So Bill does a really good job in explaining to the layman, simplifying concepts, what this channel is all about, these concepts that are related to climate change and kind of building that resource of information and knowledge so that anyone that has a scientific background or without a scientific background can pick up this book and really deep dive into understanding the concept. So building upon this layer by layer without initially saying that, you know what, I'm a subject matter expert and I know everything. So it's great in such that it helps the knowledge become more accessible to others without them having a background in science. Ultimately, Bill paints that climate change narrative slowly, whether it be the impact of extreme weather patterns, whether it be food resources, the economic side of things, public policy and how it interrelates to all of these things, development of technological resources like energy and also infrastructure, creating materials. So Bill does a great job in kind of layering upon layer, building up to those solutions and how they can interact with those real challenges. He does an amazing job at that. So through those effective storytelling skills, Bill reveals to us the gravity of the situation, what we're up against as a human species. But there's always that balance of hope and fear. So that fear and such that this is reality and this is most likely what's going to take place. Here are the repercussions. But also there's hope, right? There's hope in the sense that we still have time. We still have the ability to make that decision. So just love the balance between that hope and fear element. So in no particular order, I'm going to go through some of the important lessons learned from this book. And one of the most important lessons learned was the popularity of fossil fuels and really the history behind human use of fossil fuels, how that really started from even before the Industrial Revolution. Also the fact that they're so cheap. That's another really important part of the story. And ultimately the price that we're paying for these fossil fuel resources isn't really taking into consideration the amount of emissions and the long-term impact that it will have on generations to come. So the cost that we're paying now is relatively very less as compared to what future generations will have to pay for the resources that we've used up and used to develop our infrastructure, our transportation, and all parts of our economy. So just taking that to understanding is pretty insane. Also, another interesting concept that Bill explores is Moore's Law and how Moore's Law relates to that of energy production. So Moore's Law is typically used in the development of microprocessors and development of those chips over time. And as you can see, there's almost an exponential rise in microprocessing capabilities due to development of those technologies. Moore's Law is the principle behind the speed and capabilities of computers doubling every 2 years. And a lot of us, we look at Moore's Law and we think that this applies to other technologies like solar, wind, and other renewable sources, and that one day renewables may power our entire planet. But Bill, being a prominent investor in the energy space, he paints a comparison and really sees technological development in the energy space from a very unique lens. So a really unique comparison that Bill makes is the comparison of the first large-scale production vehicle, the Ford Model T. It was released in 1908, and he compares that to the most efficient hybrid vehicles that are available to this day. It's surprising to know that within 100 years, the fuel economy in vehicles has only improved by a factor of 3. Yes, that's within 1 century of technological development for transportation technologies. Or when it comes to solar panels, back in the 1970s, they had an efficiency of around 15%. And now if you look at solar panel efficiencies in this day and age, it has gone up to 25%. So over the past 50 years, you see a 10% increase in efficiency of producing electricity from solar panels. Bill Gates also points out how public policy and environmental regulation and other laws that are put in place in very advanced countries are really hindering development of the technologies and holding them back. And you'll see this for the nuclear energy industry, where you have a very strict regulatory guidance, but also many other restrictions that makes it difficult to develop these technologies and also implement them very fast, not only for nuclear, but other energy assets as well. So in order to avoid a climate disaster, there needs to be major changes in this realm. Bill also investigates the impact of the election cycles in the United States and how they impact researchers by these incentives and grants at times are taken away by another ruling party that might take over the presidency. So you'll see this start and stop, which for technologies and development of technologies really inhibits the long-term growth. So that's one example of some policies which make a very large, small scheme of things. It may seem like there's not a big impact being made, but in the large scheme, you'll see a significant negative impact. Another really favorite chapter of mine within this book was putting emissions into perspective. And Bill Gates says that there are only 2 numbers you need to know about climate change. The first is 51 billion. The other is 0. 51 billion is how many tons of greenhouse gases the world typically adds to the atmosphere every year. When we think of emissions, or when I thought of emissions, I really thought of those large, nasty coal power plants and also vehicles on the road. Both are, of course, large emission sources, but this chapter really put things into perspective. However, Bill Gates does a really good job in breaking down these emissions and emission sources. And what surprised me the most was actually the fact that most of our emissions in the world comes from making things, specifically concretes and steels. It's mind-blowing how much of a negative impact this has to our environment. So I would love to see nuclear technologies like small modular reactors be applied in this realm, because I feel like SMRs, and especially nuclear, has such a unique application when it comes to producing processes which can be used in these industries. What I really enjoyed learning about was the agriculture industry as well, and how agriculture also plays a really big part in producing emissions in our world. All right, so the power production chapter in this book is phenomenal. And the reason why is because it's simple, it's easy to understand. So when it comes to power production in the energy industry, we use the term called megawatts. And megawatts, it's kind of complex for the general public. So what Bill does is he compares a megawatt and he breaks down exactly how many megawatts it takes to power a city, but also your neighborhood and your home. So your home, neighborhood, a city, small town, a major city, then you get into countries. And he gives examples of how many reactor units actually it takes to do all of that. Next, he provides some really great insight into the movement of electricity through transmission lines. And when it comes to energy production, we try to focus on the power production source itself, but he talks about how transmission lines play a really important role in using up that electricity. You know, 1/3 of the electricity that's consumed, it's spent in simply the transmissions of the electricity itself, right? So he talks about transmission infrastructure and how much it costs. Also, how often it needs to be upgraded and how we need to upgrade our transmission infrastructure in North America. So this is a really interesting part of the book as well. What I was really surprised by in this book was the nuclear energy section. And the reason why is because Bill Gates is such a big advocate on nuclear power, but so I was expecting this book to have a lot of details on this specific topic. But what I found was that this topic wasn't explored to the depth of which I would kind of anticipated. I'm not surprised because Bill wants this book to be more about climate change and it's not necessarily focused on nuclear. So he does provide a really good breakdown of nuclear energy, why it's safe, and also why we practically need it, practical implications of this technology. So I think he does it justice of including it into his book, but I felt as though he could have expanded on the topic just a little bit more, maybe because I'm a nuclear advocate myself. There were a lot of technologies that I learned about in this section as well. For example, such as liquid metal batteries, flow batteries, pumped hydro. Pumped hydro is a really interesting concept that I didn't really know much about. So I learned a lot about this technology in this book. Thermal storage of electricity. He had a really good points on molten salt reactors and why they're important, and cheap hydrogen, and also carbon capture technology and where it's at in the TRL level, the technology readiness level. Transportation is another topic that we really got to focus on when it comes to reducing our emissions. And Bill does a really good job in breaking down where our transportation emissions come from. And what's interesting is that globally, worldwide, emissions from transport isn't really high. When it comes to the United States, transportation emissions is the highest in terms of the greenhouse gases. So maybe because of the individualistic culture that is there in the United States, or maybe it's because of the geography. We do have electric vehicles, which is an amazing application for battery technologies, but Bill does a really good job in talking about how batteries, they are applicable to, of course, vehicles like you see with the Tesla Model S, but unfortunately, you can't necessarily run entire planes or entire ships off of batteries alone. So he talks about how that technology has that limit in a sense, and why he thinks that there may not be one day with batteries that can do that. So that's why you need nuclear power for shipping. He's a big proponent of that, which is very interesting. But also he talks about different fuels that are used in airplanes and potential for innovation in that space. One really cool concept that I changed my mind on was the greenhouse gas emissions that are absorbed or taken up by trees. So as we know, trees, they take up carbon dioxide in our environment and are environmentally friendly, right? So you see initiatives where you have massive tree planting initiatives that are trying to offset our carbon emissions. So what's interesting is that an average tree, it takes up 4 tons of carbon dioxide through 40 years of it being around. 4 tons over 40 years, that is not enough to offset our carbon emissions. So it talks about the amount of effort and energy that it takes into planting these trees, and talks about the carbon offset that's created. So it's just really interesting how planting trees, it feels great and it may have a great impact on the environment in a sense, natural habitats, but purely looking from an objective carbon offset perspective is really a different story there. And since we're talking about agriculture, what's really interesting is the beef and dairy industry and how it makes up 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Yes, cows account for 4% of the emissions worldwide. And you know what's interesting is that cargo shipments only make up 3% of global emissions. So it's just mind-boggling how beef and dairy industry overtakes the cargo industry. It just puts into perspective how human behaviors really drive these emissions as well. Overall, this book is written in a really optimistic way in such that it doesn't necessarily paint the world as this doomsday Armageddon. Rather, it captures a realistic look of the situation, what it took humanity to get here and what it's gonna take for humanity to get out of this situation. It's like taking toothpaste out of a toothpaste tube. It's easy to get out, but getting it back in there, it's a little bit more difficult. You know, overall, Bill is a firm believer that as a human species, we can do this. I'm also a firm believer that we can take on this challenge together. It's gonna be difficult. We're gonna need to collectively work together in union. We need that interface. We need that collaboration. We need that innovative spirit to try new things, try different things. And I think we'll be able to do it. I'm personally a firm believer that humanity's role is to be a caretaker of the planet. So as a species with so many gifts like intellect and ability to develop, take these resources and create infrastructure and also create technologies, we have a lot of potential. But what we need to do as a collective species is minimize our impact on the world. This book provides a socio-political, economic, and realistic look of what has happened so far, what will continue to happen if we don't do anything, and what may happen if we develop solutions to take our planet out of this situation. No one nation can do this alone. We all need to be collectively part of this. Overall, what would I rate this book? I think I'd give it a pretty good rating. I think it's simple, it's informative, and it helps you internalize a lot of important parts about how climate change is such a multifaceted issue, and just goes to show that it's something that we need to invest more time and energy towards. So overall, highly recommend this book. Hope you get a chance to check it out. So take it from there. Thank you so much. Hope you have a nice day. Take care. Bye.